Bonjour à toutes et
Well, hello, good afternoon. Welcome to this panel on the topic of central banks at the heart of the greening of the economy. And to cover the topic, we have a very well-balanced panel with two people from central banks. Isabel SCHNABEL, who is a member of the board of the European Central Bank. Marouane EL ABASSI from the Central Bank of Tunisia. We have two people from the academia, Jezabel SOUBEYRAN from University Paris 1, she's online. You can't see her, but she can probably see us. And Lucrezia REICHLIN from the London Business School. And two people from commercial banks, Lorenzo BINI SMAGHI, chairman of the Société Générale, and Olivier NICOLAS, head of corporate banking and wealth management at LCL. I'm Olivier GARNIER. I'm a Director General in the Banque de France, and I'm a member of the Cercle des Économistes. And until a few weeks ago, I was a member of AFSE, which is an association of French economists. By way of introduction, let me cover two elements. First of all, why should central banks take into account the climate issue, and how should they take it into account? About the why, I believe that Christine Lagarde, chairman of ECB, said it very clearly yesterday in X. It's up to governments and parliaments to take care of climate, as the action in terms of climate policy often have an impact on the wealth distribution, income distribution, on the various sectors of activity that are under the control of elected authorities. So we would delude ourselves if we thought it could be done by anyone else but government. But central banks, including the European Central Bank, have a role to play for three reasons. There's a great blog that was published yesterday by Isabel SCHNABEL with her colleague Frank Henderson, covering three reasons. First of all, we know that climate change and transition policies will have an impact on price stability, and this is at the very core of their mandate. The second reason, climate hazards will have an impact on the financial system, and therefore, as supervisory bodies of the financial system, they have a major role to play. And let me remind you that in the Treaty of the EU, Article 127 says that the European Central Bank, apart from its mandate on price stability, must support the general policy of the Union to contribute to its objective, which clearly means that climate policies, which are part of European policies, come under this cap. Now, let me be brief. We have here, as I said, people from central banks, commercial banks, and people from the academia. So this is enough for the why. Now, as to how, let us distinguish two elements in the role of central banks. First of all, the issue of monetary policies with the issue of how can we model and streamline into the model for inflation forecast, how can we take into account climate transition, and then there's the instruments themselves. And that's the first point. And second point, more for commercial bankers, it's the topic of supervision and financial regulations. And let me finish by saying that yesterday the European Central Bank published the first results of the first climate stress test on banks. And Christine Lagarde said a lot of progress had been made, but still there was some leeway. In France, a year ago, we carried out the first pilot climate stress test on banks and insurance. So to start with, let me give the floor to the two people from central banks, and starting with Isabel. Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this panel. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I would love to speak French, but I can't.
To English, I'm sorry for this. I hope you can understand me nevertheless. So, as Olivier already mentioned, this was actually an important week for the ECB with regards to climate change because we published two things. So first of all, we published the first steps that we are going to take with regard to greening our monetary policy. And the second thing is that we published our first bottom-up climate stress test. I'm going to talk more about monetary policy here, but of course I'm happy to discuss the other issue in the discussion. So almost precisely 1 year ago, we published our climate change action plan. And this was in the context of our monetary policy strategy review. And in that action plan, we committed to contribute within our mandate to the fight against climate change. And as Olivier already mentioned, there was a clear understanding that climate change has fundamental effects on the economy and in particular on inflation. And in a recent speech, I actually distinguished three different types of inflation that may arise from climate change. So the first I called climateflation. So this is the effect of climate change itself, which is, say, if there is a drought or wildfire, you have bad harvests and food prices go up. So that's the first example. The second is fossilflation, which is related to the increase of fossil fuels in the transition to a greener economy, and one example is carbon pricing. And the third is what I called greenflation, and this is actually when there is this push towards renewable energy and there is suddenly a big demand for certain raw materials like, I don't know, copper and lithium, and that may again create inflation. And so indeed, climate change is really at the core of our primary mandate of price stability. In addition, the fight against climate change is, of course, a top priority of European lawmakers, and that means that we actually have an obligation under our secondary mandate to support the general economic policies of the EU, again, as Olivier said, without prejudice to price stability, and this actually fosters the case for us getting involved in these climate change topics. And we have now taken several quite significant steps in order to green our monetary policy. And the first and maybe one of the most relevant ones refers to our corporate bond holdings. So as you may know, previously these corporate bond purchases were kind of dictated by what we call the market neutrality principle, which basically meant that we would buy bonds according to the outstanding bonds in the market. But what we discovered is that that actually led to quite a substantial bias towards emission-intensive firms. And therefore, we decided to decarbonize our portfolios over time in line with the EU climate neutrality goals and the Paris Agreement. And therefore, going forward, we are going to use a tilting approach according to an internal scoring model that relies on greenhouse gas emissions, on greenhouse gas reduction plans, and on disclosures. The second important measure refers to collateral, where we define a maximum share of assets from high-emitting companies that a bank can mobilize as collateral in our lending operations. The third is related to climate disclosures, and we said that only firms will be eligible both as collateral and also for asset purchases if they comply with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, in short CSRD. And in addition, we also improve our own climate-related exposure. So as of the first quarter of 2023, so next year, we're going to publish the emissions of our non-monetary policy portfolios, it's like pension funds, own funds, and also of our corporate bond portfolios. And finally, we are also reassessing our risk management systems, and we are asking whether the ratings that we are using, both internal and external, properly reflect climate-related risks. So of course the ECB is facing a lot of criticism, and actually from both sides. So there are people who say we are doing too little, and there are people who are saying we are doing too much. And honestly, we would like even to be a bit quicker, but we are facing quite a few limitations on the legal side, on the operational side, but also with regard to data availability. And data actually plays a very important role in the green transition. The second point I would like to make is that those who think that climate change is not a part of our mandate should be aware that our goal to contribute to the fight against climate change in our monetary policy doesn't mean that we change our monetary policy stance. So we are not going to buy more bonds simply because of climate change, or we're not going to lend more money to banks for that reason. So it's always a priority of objectives, starting with price stability and then other issues. But, and let me close with this, but we hope very much that our actions can play a catalyst role in greening the financial system, especially by strengthening incentives for climate-related disclosures, and of course by strengthening incentives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Merci, merci Isabelle.
Thank you, Isabel. She presented the viewpoint of a central bank. With Marouane, we have a central banker from a southern country who might, in fact, be more exposed to climate change. Marouane, how do you see this from the viewpoint of a central bank like that of Tunisia? Well, thank you. I'm very happy to be with you. You know, I come from a Mediterranean country. Can you hear me? I hope to be able to perform as well as our friend from the European Central Bank, because we're considered as one of the Mediterranean countries and we're supposed to be highly talkative. So I'll hope to stick to the time allotted. I have someone from the region who is supposed to be the timekeeper. I don't know where she is from. So, to try and answer your question directly, if I take the example of the southern central banks, we are faced with huge difficulties. My country, for example, met with a lot of issues. For the past 11 years, it's been going through a period of political transition, which is very complicated, plus the COVID crisis. And after the COVID crisis, we were quite resilient, but then came the Ukrainian war. So all this had an impact, obviously, which has an immediate effect with an increasing in the deficits, for example, the budgetary deficit and trade balance deficit. And governments are faced with problems and then therefore turn to the central banks. And the issue of central bank remaining independent, especially in our countries, is very difficult to manage. So if you integrate the climate change in that, I'll try to be, correct in my speech. I would say that for us, for countries such as ours, it's not a huge priority, especially in view of the crisis. I'm saying this, but it is the truth. The situation is such that we have a very short-term logic and one at medium and long term. And the very short term today is to be able to manage the food for our population. We have to feed our populations. We have to supply the enough energy for the country. We have to have the right funds for that, and we have to be able to contain the impact of the various successive crises. So, if I take the example of the Tunisian central bank, We have been part of all initiatives, whether you talk about Paris or the network of central banks for the greening of the economy. We've been part of all international initiatives. The problem is, yes, we are into it, but are we efficient? Do we have international fundings taking into account all these issues that we're facing today? Well, the reality is that we don't. There are huge difficulties, and we have the constraints of climate change as well. Today, one of our main topics is the problem of water stress and desertification, erosion. All these impacts require a lot of investments. We need to invest massively to be able to use the resource. And if you don't invest, this has a direct impact on many areas which, apart from being arid, meet with a more and more complex situation. So what is the solution? We've talked a lot about the special drawing rights. There was an initiative by Mr. Macron in Paris at a time to say that at one point there should be an appropriate funding via a fund, a special fund to manage the quote-unquote ecological crisis, but and the last initiative is that of the IMF in April. I believe, unfortunately, that the funds are not there. We're talking about $40 billion now, but the needs are more of the essence of 100 or $180 billion if you have to manage the debt of African countries. So next to that, the climate issues and plus the climate shock, the problem of the various crises are such that if you don't coordinate properly all the policies and at the monetary level, at political level, you will have problems, and you have to do something to solve problems at more than the national level, because Algeria has tried that, but we now have to look at things under a different angle. We have to understand that problems are global issues, and we have to have a global solution. Thank you, Marouane, for sticking to the time. The credibility of central banks was at stake. Now we have online Jezabel COUPPEY SOUBEYRAN. Jezabel, I feel like asking you. Earlier on, Isabel was saying that some people feel that the ECB does too much, others that the ECB does not do enough. What would you answer to that, especially in view of the latest announcements of ECB? Well, thank you, Olivier. I have a lot of echo. I hope you can hear me properly. Yes, can you hear me? Yes? Yes, we hear you very well, loud and clear. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to join this prestigious panel, which is highly balanced, as you were saying, and I'm sorry I'm far away. From what we hear, it's very encouraging, because one notes that what has been greened is not only the way central banks talk, but also the way they act. And the announcements of last 4th of July by the ECB, and which Isabel SCHNABEL has explained, is quite encouraging. These portfolio of bonds of is being green, the guaranteeing devices are being greened, and we're starting with a new monetary policy for that. And this goes even beyond what had been announced in the roadmap of the strategic revision a year ago. So the elements that were part of the strategic revision are the review, sorry, are there. But we go even beyond that with the announcement of the ECB. And therefore, the ECB is taking the lead of central banks that are greening their action together with the British or the English central bank, but some are lagging behind, like the Fed in the US and most central banks in emerging countries, even though when you listen to Marouane El Abassi, you realize that they are aware of the issue. But if you look at what central banks in emerging countries do, apart from a few exceptions, you do see that the greening of the monetary policy is not of the essence. We can say that the European Central Bank has taken a big step, with a few exceptions, obviously, but it's still a small step for climate. I don't want to underestimate the step that has been taken, as I said, but we shouldn't underestimate what is to be done, because what has been announced by the European Central Bank is only about corporate bonds and corporate assets. And this comes at a time when the programs for asset purchase are going to be stopped. There will no longer be any purchase apart from the investment of payback amounts. So it will be rather marginal. And moreover, the schedule is extremely wide, up to 2026 for some devices, which is not in line with the pace of climate change. I feel, without underestimating the legal and operational obstacles mentioned by Isabel SCHNABEL, I feel that the present mandate of ECB enables them to go further.
We do see that the ECB today is fully aware of climate deregulation that's attacking monetary stability, the economic stability, and that they must act, but they're still far from using all of the room to maneuver that they have in their mandate to green monetary policy. Their financing operations. So there are things that should be greened, that many think tanks say this. It would have the advantage of having the conditions for refinancing depend on the decarbonization of the bank balances, taking into account the initial situation and avoiding penalizing the adaptation efforts made by establishments whose initial balance would not be green enough, whose initial assessment would not be green enough. And so this is an interesting proposal at a constant mandate, and this is what interests the ECB. At a constant mandate, this would be the greatest contribution that it could make to solving climate deregulation. And I'm going to conclude with these aspects. We have to be aware that the current mandate, the current remit of the Euro system holds back the capacity of the central bank to finance the environmental transition. There's Article 123 that prevents direct financial assistance to countries and thus prevents the ECB and national central banks from financing investment programs, public investment programs in ecological transition without putting the central bank's monetary power at the service of environmental transition. It's highly unlikely that we'll reach the right investments 3 or 4 GDP points per year to reduce our CO2 emissions by half by 2030 and reach carbon neutrality by 2050. So if you like, if we look at these financing aspects, there are distinctions that can be made. The financing of profitable investments in the ecological transition can go through financial markets, private actors, financial actors and banks. This is not really a problem. But the financing of less profitable investments requires more patient investors, public banks in particular. This requires more public money, and at this level there can be direct loans from the central bank to countries that can be useful. And there's also another investment mass that's required. To finance this, we'd have to go even further. We'd have to authorize the central bank to not only loan to countries, but to actually give them money from the central bank. So this goes beyond the helicopter financing. It's a cargo plane for monetary policy within the framework of governance that would be appropriate. The central bank can't decide to use this option because it goes beyond its remit. But public policy makers and private policy makers amongst you can make this decision, and the citizens that we all are can also do it. So I think we need to realize the importance of this monetary power and how it could transform our societies to focus on the common good. Thank you, Jezabel. During the discussion, Isabel will have the time to come back to what we should do with an open telte and what the central banks can do to finance states. So let's move on to our commercial bankers now. We looked at the central bank for monetary policy, but we could look at financial supervision and regulatory supervision. We'll start with Lorenzo, who was, no one's perfect. He was also a central banker in Italy and at the ECB. Thank you. As a French banker, sitting beside my supervisor,
I will speak English to make sure I don't say things that could be misinterpreted. So we understand now that greening the economy is not the primary mandate of the monetary policy, and I think it's right. But since central banks have to support the economic policies of the government, it's obvious that this is a clear mandate subject to price stability. Now, I think there are two ways to implement this mandate. One, I would call it to be consistent with. That is, make sure that your monetary policy or your supervisory policy is consistent with the mandate of the authorities. And I think Isabel mentioned, in particular, look at your macro policy framework, at all the aspects in order to forecast inflation, maybe in a better way than we did in the past. Take into account all the structural changes that will happen and that are going to happen, and try to make sure that monetary policy is consistent with a better framework. Now, I think the ECB is doing this. That's very good. The only comment I would make is we have to be humble, because structural changes are just very difficult to understand, to forecast. We come out of a decade of structural changes in the opposite direction, which led us to underestimate inflation in the opposite. So my suggestion is, we have to discuss and be open, but be cautious. On the supervisory side, because I look at central bank activity on the monetary policy and supervision, of course the task of supervisors is to make sure that the supervisory policy is consistent with making sure that the primary objective, financial stability, takes into account the risks that come from the climate change. And so looking at banks' risk management, doing the stress tests, and we just came out of a stress test. And I want to make a comment on that. I think if we look around the economy and we look at which sectors are doing most in order to align themselves with the objectives of the COP, the various COPs, and try to anticipate and to adapt, I think the financial sector comes first or very close to being first. So I think we as banks have to be proud that we are really up to date, and there are so many agreements between banks, commitments, and if you go to shareholder meetings, you see how this issue is relevant. And second, I would say, if you look at the financial sector all over the world, I would say that European financial sector, and if I can say proudly, the French financial sector, is at the avant-garde of this. So this is just to say that, sometimes it's a bit frustrating to read the comments, even by, our supervisors, that we should do more. Yes, of course we should do more, but we have done a lot, and it would be important to recognize that we have done a lot, and we have to do more together. And in particular, what is key, I think, is the fact that our job depends on our relationship with the clients, with our clients, with companies. And we cannot have different requirements from those that our companies have. So there is an issue of consistency here between what our companies are required to do in terms of data, for instance, data provision, certification, and what we can do. It's very difficult for us to do our job if our clients, the companies, are subject to different data requirements, and this is a European issue. So this is consistency. I would move second to the second thing that central banks can do is to be proactive, to try to change things even beyond the trend. And Isabel mentioned the collateral policy. I think that is very interesting. Again, here the question is, how far can you go without creating distortions in the market? And I'm sure that's a question you ask yourself, because you don't want to have unintended consequences. And so when you move even more to greening your collateral, as it was suggested by our colleague here, you have to take into account what does it mean. Given that we are at the beginning of a phase, it could create bubbles, for instance, if the central bank does much more than the rest of the economy. Second example is supervision. Using supervision as a tool to accelerate. And here, again, we have to be very prudent not to produce unintended consequences. For instance, the threat of increasing capital requirements because of these risks, will it really help? Now, the ECB has not threatened, but when sometimes I read some speeches, I tend to see between the lines some threats. Well, maybe the ultimate risk is that you create additional capital buffers that, if the degree of substitution is not sufficiently, as economists would say, sufficiently large, then it will lead to an overall reduction of lending, even to the green sector, rather than an increase in lending. So we have to be very careful.
Lorenzo?
Yes? Yeah. Stop. 30 seconds. Final message, in my view, for the supervisor and the policy authorities, there is one fundamental issue in Europe. If we don't have an integrated capital market, we will not be able to provide all the financing that is needed to foster the greening of the economy. So the central bank, I know, are doing a lot of things, but all the authorities have to move to create a single financial and capital market in Europe. And we know that this is not done because there are people who do not want it, to be very blunt. So we have to leverage on those who want it, like the central bank, to make sure that in the next few years we're able to build this. Thank you.
Merci Lorenzo. Je note d'ailleurs que
Thank you, Lorenzo. Yesterday, when she spoke yesterday, Christine Lagarde called for the union of capital markets at the level of the central banks. We all agree on this point. So to continue on the bank side with Olivier NICOLAS and with the prudential aspects and regulations, for a a commercial bank, and with everything that's said, I'm going to stay sober because energy transition is a type of sobriety. I only have 6 minutes. I'm going to try to respect them. We have in front of us a mountain that we need to climb. We have a hard time determining it. How many peaks will there be? There's 100 billion of additional investment. All these figures, if they're not very precise, give the size of the effort that must be made, particularly in terms of financing and investment. There's equity and debt that are together in this. So if we make these efforts, if we make these investments, can we reduce others? My feeling is that no. I know companies well, the companies in France. We cannot say today that they are all at a critical size, that they have the international size that they should have in order to be resilient. They've not necessarily made all the investments in innovation and digitalization that they should make. So we're not going to stop these investments. Companies will not stop making these investments to only make green investments. And I'm not sure if we did that, the result would be what we expected. So even if there's an intersection between the investments that we can make, there could be a very digital dimension and a positive impact on energy transition, etc. All of this must be additive, must be cumulative, and we need to finance it. And to finance all of this, there's only the banks. We're in a country on a continent where there is quite a significant financial intermediation by the banks for individuals, for companies, from small to very large sizes. Jezabel said that companies do not all go to the financial markets to get funds, and so the banks have to help. When you're a bank, you need liquidity and you need equity. It's physical, it's quantitative, and if you don't have these two ingredients, we cannot do it. The central bank is not a magician, but it has the power to make some adjustments on these two dimensions, which are the requirement for equity. For equity, if we have more requirements, if we need to take more risks, if when all other things being equal, when we ask for just more equity, we won't succeed. That's a quantitative problem, a physical problem. That's a discussion that we have to have with the regulators. They're taking place right now. We know that there are other deadlines coming up. Basel IV. This requires more equity. It's not good news. So if we need more equity for Basel IV, we won't have equity for greening, for decarbonation, etc. There's also a risk, the risk of the energy transition, and I don't necessarily know how to qualify it, how to determine it. From a macro standpoint, on a credit portfolio, there are some companies in certain sectors who are very ahead and won't have problems, and others who will have problems. We have to go into microeconomic analyses on a case-by-case basis, company by company. Have they made the turn? Will they take the turn? Will they be impacted or not? There's no single truth, no single rule. And here we really have to go and work on a case-by-case basis. So for the addition of equity for energy transition seems quite dangerous because it would be counterproductive with respect to the global needs for financing that I've already mentioned. So we need to look at this, look at all these elements. Today we don't have a real framework, a setup for information for forecasts. So prudentially, the risks are short-term ones, and the models we use are one-year default models, and the risk of energy transition is not a one-year problem. It's 5 years, 10, 15 years. So we're not all properly equipped with tools to do this. We don't necessarily have the correct data. But when we're speaking right now, we know that we don't have these tools. As Jezabel said earlier, the central bank was very good in the last crises to provide banks with liquidity that we needed. If we go back to the subprime crisis, European debt, and COVID, each time the central bank imagined very good solutions. We talked about open TLT. this could be a good solution because we'll need this in the future. We can't just look at these as 3 to 4 year monetary policies. The subject interests us. It's very open with long investments, so we need long-term liquidity. When we had the subprime crisis, the first market that opened up was common bonds because the central banks bought them. So when the central bank buys the ones that are in line with energy transition, this could help us to deleverage, to lighten up the banking balance sheet. That's important. And to conclude, what I'd like to say, what seems important is I talked a lot about capacity problems for banks to accompany transition. One thing that is certain is that there isn't a problem of will. We all want to do this. We will all want to work with our customers in energy transition, and so they have to commit to decarbonizing their portfolio transparently to measure that the euros that we lend to our customers are used for the right cause, to emit less and less carbon. These are strong commitments that will push our clients, that will push the economy to change, to transform. And we need to put all of these things side by side. What's missing today is a real global vision. We need to solve the equation, an equation with a lot of unknowns, but we still have to ask these questions. Thank you, Olivier. Lucrezia is going to speak last. And so she can bring up some of the monetary policy elements and also possibly prudential elements. So Lucrezia was also a center banker. She managed research at the European Central Bank in the early 2000s.
It's always nice to be the last. Yeah, can you hear me? So, well, first of all, I think that everybody is in agreement here that climate transition is the most important task of our time, is an existential problem, and however, policies have not really followed on our commitment. Even the Paris Agreement is an objective that seems to be very far from being reached. So in this context, and this will be my premise, all have responsibilities, and central banks have responsibility, but so has the private sector, banks, and the capital market. Of course, public policy as the primary actor, but also civil societies. Now, this is the point that Lagarde has made. The central banks have to be in this topic, although they don't have, they're not the first mover. And I very much agree with that, and I think this is also what Isabel said. Why are central banks important? And this is also something that Isabel said. They're important as investors. They are a big investor with big balance sheet. They're important as a regulator. But also, climate risks affect the way in which monetary policy is conducted because it affects price stability and has implications both for the operational framework and the strategy. And this is maybe something that we are really at the beginning of understanding these things. This is really the new game in town for central banks to understand what this implies for inflation targeting, for example. So I will have 3 points. The first one is something that Isabella has already touched upon, is that the main criticism to what the ECB has announced, the tilting of its own portfolio, is that this is not neutral. Now, the principle of non-neutrality is a principle which is highly controversial because, this principle is defined as buying bonds in proportion to the outstanding quantities of bonds, okay? So in a way that does not alter the price of assets. Now, this principle, and this is empirical evidence, has shown that this has meant that actually the portfolio of the ECB is brown. Why is it the case? Because the big emitters are also the big issuers of bonds. They have, tangible assets, so good collateral, so it's easy for them to issue bonds, and this is why the portfolio of the ECB is tilted
to Brown. And so the principle of neutrality in a context in which asset purchases really act by altering the cost of capital, is not obviously that has to be the principle that had been stated before. And in fact, there is academic research that has actually suggested other principles related to, to the fact that the way in which asset purchases act is really by altering the cost of capital and they altering the risk profile of the portfolio. And so, we know that, and this is also a point from research, that the big emitters are also riskier. They trade at a risk premium. So that, why? Because emissions and climate risk are financially material. So this is a problem for central banks, but it's also a problem for the private sector. It's so much for the problem of the private sectors that we now have regulations and standards and stress tests and all kinds of tools to make sure that the private sector face this risk. So I think it's really an obvious next step to ask the central bank to do the same with its own portfolio. Now, there are many issues, however, and there is not much time to think about it, but I would like Isabel maybe in the second round to talk about it. Now we are shrinking the balance sheet, so presumably tilting will imply to get rid of some bonds in some key sectors. This, of course, carries the risk of stranded assets, which is a well-known risk also for the private sector. So the way in which you conduct this kind of green policy is really important. It's very important to be mindful of the transition risk, to be mindful of the fact that it's not just emissions that matters, but also the way in which companies adjust the strategy and their business model with respect to this risk, okay? We don't want all the energy companies to be closed tomorrow because that's going to be a problem, okay? So this is really the transition risk, which is very important. Again, for that, we need to have data and standards in order to, to do what it needs to be done, okay? So I come to my second point. So we need to have standards and we need to have data. This is true for the private sector, but it's also true for the ECB. How can you do these policies if you don't have reliable standards and data? So this is a topic which doesn't excite a lot of people, but it excites me a lot because I've been involved in the standard setting work, and we are in a world in which we don't have globally comparable standards. There are lots of private organizations which issue voluntary standards. They're not mandatory, they're not audited, they're not assured, and this leads to greenwashing. So the aspiration of having globally comparable standards, it's very important, especially in a world that is becoming more and more balkanized. Since climate is a public good and is a global public good, we need to have standards for Chinese companies, for Italian companies, French companies, Tunisian companies, and so on. And so it's very good that Europe is ahead of, of the game, but we need these globally comparable standards, and actually these are not there. And there is the ECB may have a role in actually helping this convergence. The third point, I don't have time to talk about it, but is really about how to adjust the strategies when climate risk would imply two things. One is, high frequency of relative price shock and supply shocks, so nasty trade-offs for which the usual demand policy is not, the right tool, okay? So there is a set of issues there. And the other set of issues is that transition will cost money. It will mainly be fiscal money. Even if we don't believe that central banks should finance government, there is a question of how they will be supportive of public debt that is likely to go up rather than down.
Merci, Lucrezia. Donc maintenant, nous avons un peu...
Thank you, Lucrezia. We have a few minutes to discuss. There's some questions online. So I'd like to come back to Isabel. There were some questions. Jezabel talked about an open TLT, and Nicolas, the commercial bankers, came back to this idea, and there was another question that went even further for Jezabel, but also Lucrezia. Jezabel went farther, saying perhaps the central banks need to monetize debt in order to finance green investments. So that's not what Lucrezia said. But there was this question about how to finance green investments and what can central banks do. Isabel?
So we had many interesting questions. So maybe I start actually with Jezabel, who argued that the ECB could do much more in financing climate investment. And of course, one has to be aware of the fact that we are acting within a certain legal framework, and that there are limits to what we can do. So it's not that we can simply finance whatever investment seems to be desirable from a societal perspective. What we do, of course, is that we have an impact on financing conditions through our policies. And one of the most striking facts, I think, if we look at the past years, so before the pandemic, is the question. I mean, given the huge investment needs that were already there at the time and the extremely low interest rates. So why didn't governments not make use of these very favorable financing conditions to seriously start all those investments? But we actually see that over that time there was very small elasticity of investment relative to interest rates. I mean, there is a question how this was related to fiscal rules.
Et il faut voir dans quelle mesure c'est lié aux règles fiscales, etc. Mais c'est un sujet très intéressant. Alors, un point qui a été mentionné à plusieurs.
Stock of assets is going to be reduced. What's going to happen to the greening of the corporate bond stock? And in fact, I always argued it's not about flows, it's really about stock. So if we believe that the stock of our assets is biased, it may not be sufficient to adjust the flows, but at some point one may have to think about adjusting the stock. I should say that there's no decision so far on adjusting the stock, because that it's a bit more controversial than adjusting the flows. So far it's only the reinvestment. I should say these reinvestments are pretty big. So at the moment we have something like 30 billion per year, which is still, I mean, it's quite a bit, because our portfolios are actually very large. I should also say that maybe it's not just the purchases that we are actually conducting, but of course we are also sending important signals to financial markets that we are really being serious about this issue, and this will hopefully have effects well beyond the actual purchases that we do. On the green TLTRO, we always said that this is something that we could also consider. We have not yet taken any decisions on that. I mean, there's of course in a sense the same issue that I discussed before, namely that I mean, of course, you first need a monetary policy objective for conducting these operations. And I mean, of course, during the pandemic, we were doing a lot of refinancing operations, and there was a reason to do that. Of course, if there is no such reasons to run those operations, then it becomes much more difficult. So I fully agree, by the way, with Lorenzo, who argued that we, in a sense, I mean, you didn't use the word, but that we need a green capital markets union. I always thought that this could be a branding that could really make a difference. But somehow, I mean, we haven't yet, I think, the dynamic that we need. And there, I think Lucrezia is very right that, of course, this is also related to all these issues of standards. And, of course, these standards, it's not sufficient that they are European, but at least they have to be European. And then, ideally, they should be global. I mean, on your points on capital, I mean, of course, the capital. I mean, I'm not a supervisor myself. We have the Chinese wall within the ECB, as you know well. But of course, the capital requirements have to reflect the risks that are there. And I mean, I'm reminded of discussions that I had with my PhD supervisor, Martin Helwig, who had strong views on capital, on bank capital, but I won't repeat that. Thank you.
Alors, malheureusement, comme il nous reste très peu de minutes, mais rapidement, peut-être Lorenzo, j'ai envie de...
Very briefly, Lorenzo, I feel like turning to you. Do central banks do enough or not enough in terms of greening monetary policy? And this time I'm going to speak French, if you want. I would say that in Europe we should be proud of taking the lead. whether we look at the central bank, there's no comparison. The result is 6-0, 6-0 with the Fed, for example. And we have a process, really. It's a process, but to answer Isabel and what she mentioned about the supervisor, investors all over the world are not forced to invest in European banks. They can invest in other sectors, or they can invest in banks in other countries. So we have to have a profitability of equity that is attractive. We're not utilities. I know that some people in the academia would want banks to be utilities, but we are not. We have to be attractive to investors. And I believe we do a lot to try and be attractive, because today when I talk to investors and shareholders, they ask us to be green. They ask us to have a green P&L sort and a green balance. And we've been trying to do that for a long time, but you can't add on a lot of layers of equity because, as was being said, we can't do everything. And if I'm to finish on this same topic, we do not have a capital market. So all finances that are, and all financial flows produced in Europe have to be on the P&L of banks. And it has to be well done if we don't want to have a systemic risk. So we could have to develop this capital market, whether it be a green one or a blue one or whatever you want to, blue if you want to give it the color of Europe. But we won't have the energy transition in Europe if we don't have this European capital market. And if we do not have a European capital market, it's because someone doesn't want us to. Just like someone didn't want, some people didn't want the monetary union a while ago, or a banking union 20 years ago. So these people maybe wanted to keep their power on their markets. So we have to fight this at political level, and I hope that the president, the prime ministers in Italy, the chancellor in Germany will realize that we won't do this if we won't have this proper greening, if we don't have this financial integration in Europe. Thank you, Lorenzo. If I'm to conclude, I would say there's a federating topic, that of the Union of Capital Markets, and at marketing level, which would be, we would call it the Union of Green Capital Markets, or the Green Union, whatever name you want to give it. And Lorenzo was saying maybe some people are opposed to it or don't want that, but maybe it's a technical topic that is not really fascinating to political authorities, and there may not be so many obstacles after all. Maybe via the greening, it would be a way of telling the public opinion and governance, and as the public opinion is what is moving governments to us, they will have to tell the governments that this capital market is important for the planet and climate. Thank you.